A lot of your earlier work, reflects a lot of your earlier travels, but this seems much more personal and closer to home. Is there a sense that you're coming home with this exhibition?
All my work has always had a sense of autobiography about it. So wherever I've travelled, that's given me the inspiration to make my work. But in the last 5 years, I've been closer to home. So the work has picked up from being in Ireland, definitely, yes.
Why conflict?
Conflict was the starting point of the show. And I usually don't know where I'm starting, but there's always one piece that starts the journey. And conflict, there's two pieces called conflict. One made out of bronze and one made out of wax and white gold. And they're the two lasts. They come from a market in Italy, and they're old antique wooden lasts that were covered with woodworm. But what I thought was beautiful about them was that they were tied together. And one is male and one is female. So they're obviously not a pair. Yet they've been a pair probably now for 150 years. So I wanted to get this idea of when people travel a journey together, there is conflict, but sometimes you need that conflict to become a pair.
And for a while now, you've been working as an artist in residence in the Northwest Hospice. Could you talk us through just sort of what you do in the hospice?
You're not there to teach. You're there to give the people there an opportunity to see things differently, perhaps, and to share their thoughts and their memories. And a lovely example I can give is this guy called Andy, and he died recently. But for 2 years, I filmed him singing. But then I'd go back a few months later, and I'd show him the film of him singing, and he'd forgotten that he sang, and he'd get so excited he'd start singing again. So I'd film him watching him singing. So I've got hours of him watching him, and the joy that he got from that is just incredible. It's lovely.
Could you maybe talk us through a couple of the pieces, maybe beginning with the bronze mask?
That's myself, and it's called Death Mask. And the reason that was made was because I think that, or I know that people celebrate and are aware of what people do after they die. People celebrate each other for what they've done when they're gone. And that piece was a reference to make us realise that perhaps we should celebrate people when they're still alive and acknowledge them rather than when they're dead and gone.
And there's some really unusual materials in there, in particular the Locusts. Could you tell us sort of a little bit about the origin of that piece?
The Locust piece started off in Italy a couple of years ago. I was there for 4 months doing residency. And I wanted to portray, someone had died and I didn't know how to say it, I didn't know what to do. And it's called silent noise because it's that noise that's in your head that nobody else can hear, but you know it's there. And also by being away, the locusts are so alive, that noise of the cicadas and the warmth. But locusts are, in their very nature, you can't control them. So what they do is they fly in big, huge swarms. They land somewhere for no rhyme or reason, and they cause mass destruction, and then they go off again. So that piece was just about the vulnerability of life and death as well, and the noise that goes on in your head. Life,
Death, destruction, vulnerability. Would you say you're someone who works in extremes?
Entirely.
And is that's something that obviously attracts you and that you sort of seek out?
I need to work very hard. I need to work all the time. It's not a conscious thing, but if I'm not stimulated and I don't feel something inside, it's not worth it for me. And I do it without much thought. I dive straight into it. And this is obviously what's very much in my mind at the moment. Extremes, perhaps.
A lot of the work, as we've discussed, there's a lot of death in there, but there's also a lot of beauty. Do you sort of go in with a dark material in your mind and then try and bring some beauty to it as well, or drag some beauty out of it?
I think the topic shouldn't be dark. I think that's the thing I'm trying to say, is that death is not dark. But whilst I'm working with these different mediums, for me it's incredibly important that they're beautiful. The aesthetics to me are crucial. And I'd like to say, to be very honest, I don't know what the piece is necessarily about until I'm finished. But it is important that it is beautiful, yes.
Looking at the pieces, it seems that some of them seem like they're almost perched at that moment just before death. there any sort of sense of that from your perspective?
I think every single piece should make you reflect, not necessarily by the death, but what goes on just prior. Like the piece of the feet on the bench. The bench was built exactly to the dimension of the scale of the man's feet. So it is the size of a coffin, but obviously I wanted a metaphor. And the piece is not necessarily about the feet, it's about you projecting what's not there. And you don't have to think of the person necessarily as dead. No one said the person's dead or alive, but it's for you to consider who this person was. So it's trying to say the same story as the death mask, I think.
You've worked, in so many different mediums. Do you just get bored? Do you have to move on to other things?
I get bored very easy. Part of it, I have to be stimulated constantly. All my paint material has all been put in a box, but rather than be tempted to paint, I had to get nails and gaffer tape to control myself so I wouldn't go near the paint. But I really like the idea of what I'm doing at the moment, because I have to consider things a little bit more, and I'm finding items that have got history. So I'm trying to bring in things from the past and make them new as well.
You talk a lot about having a very concise idea of what you want to communicate. Do you feel like you're approaching some sort of endpoint with some of your work, or?
I think it's slightly moving on, that it's about vulnerability and awareness, not necessarily about life and death, but being more aware of who we are as people. For example, the frog piece called 5 Frogs in a Victorian Box. That piece is about people putting labels on people, and that once a label is put on you, do you carry that label, and do you become that person of, you're stupid, you're drunk, you're crazy. And somebody a couple of years ago said to me, you're mad as a box of frogs. And I went, ho, ho, ho. And then when I went home, I went, I don't like that. Because it made me start thinking how labels stick to you. And that's not necessarily a very good thing.
And you can get a bit of revenge now through your exhibition.
No, that's mean. I'm not mean.
What's important is not to talk about it on television or something where somebody might see it.
Exactly. She's not mad. Yeah. There are no frogs.
Did the frogs and the locusts die a natural death?
The locusts were imported alive. Big boxes arrived at the kitchen. They were leaping all over the place. We had to put them in the fridge, but they kept leaping around. So it sounds awful. This is totally allowed because they're brought over for food, for snakes. It's totally fine. Am I going to get killed for this?
No, it's totally good.
And then the locusts were... I looked up how to eat locusts, because people do eat them, and you bake them very slowly for an hour and a half at a low heat.
Right.
And then each one was stuck on one by one by one.
You were in Dublin in the 1990s, and it was a very different art scene, very different energy around, but you're still here, you're still working away, but now in the west of Ireland. What's changed for you? What are the biggest differences that you've noticed?
Well, for me in the west of Ireland, I do miss the buzz, the interaction, the lack of places to visit, lack of art spaces, obviously due to the lack of funding as well. But I wonder if that's because I've also left Dublin, because in the 90s there was less of an apathy. I think people were much more experimental, they support each other more, it was more creative. And maybe now, and I do believe this, I think because we've just gone through a recession, that people will be getting back to their roots and actually start to make things and be more considered. Whereas before there was more money and people were just throwing out pieces of work or film or sculptures. Whereas now we have to really think about what we do. So maybe the quality will be better. And being at it for so long, nobody else will have me do anything else. And I love it. I love it.
Is it hard in that kind of, when you're in the middle of that sort of mix and that energy, is it hard to find your own artistic voice? In a way, did you have to get away from that to find what you really wanted to say?
No, I've always been incredibly selfish about taking my own time, and I've been very good at going to a studio every single day and closing the door, because you do need a lot of time to make work. And I think that for me, it doesn't matter whether I work in the city centre or the country, because you create your own mental space where, for me, I create my own mental space wherever I am.
Do you know where you're going to go next?
I don't know. I really, really don't know. Actually, that's not true. I've just imported loads of glass eyes. They are amazing. They're beautiful hand-blown glass eyes, the same colours as mine. So I think I'm going to do something with the eyes. That's what's next week anyway.